What caused 100 years of history to seemingly vanish without a trace? And why are the Poneglyphs the only source of information that we have for this so-called Void Century? And what did the Gorosei really mean by having another great cleansing? Well, today I'm going to explain exactly what happened over 800 years ago, and even how Imu's powers let them get away with it scot-free. But please make sure to drop a like because it really does make a difference in that all-important algorithm. Anyway, on to the mega theory.
Yeah.
Let's start by talking about what we already know about this seemingly empty 100-year span in One Piece history, like how it has also been called the 100-year void, or even the blank century because there is almost no history written on it anywhere. And the great cleansing that we've already heard of may very well have something to do with it. But we also know that the void century occurred between 800 and 900 years before our current storyline, and very little is known about it other than what is written on the Poneglyphs. So there is essentially a gap in historical record where nothing was written down, as if everyone disappeared for some amount of time. I mean, Robin has read about it before on a Poneglyph, but I think some of our best information on it is actually from Goncho of the Tontada tribe. In chapter 726, we learn that the Tontadas had very specific information about their history up until 900 years ago. Then there is just a blank 100-year slate where the history then picks back up with King Riku's family taking it over 800 years ago. This implies that there truly is just a void century. It's not that everyone was wiped out in a massive genocide, or that civilizations were entirely destroyed since Dressrosa was still standing when King Riku's family took over, so it almost just seems as if everything skipped forward 100 years in time. I mean, how else could history pick back up right away without any mention of mass genocide? And how did the history from before 900 years ago stay intact? It seems as if everything just stopped for 100 years and then picked back up right where it left off. But it's weird since the Poneglyphs prove that not everyone experienced the Void Century the same way. And that's because the true history of this 100-year gap can be determined by reading 9 specific Poneglyphs that comprise the Rio Poneglyph, which means the true text of history. And so far, the Poneglyphs seem to be the only recorded history of that 100-year gap, indicating that they were written during the Void Century, which is backed up by Clover. Plus, we already know that the Poneglyphs were made in Wano, and then after the Void Century ended 800 years ago, the stones were left to be guarded by descendants of ancient civilizations, like Shandora, Alabasta, and otherwise. And it appears that you also get the true history by making it to Laugh Tale as well. But even then, that requires reading the 4 Lode Poneglyphs first. So no matter what, to get the true history, you have to read the Poneglyphs. That seems to be the only way. So that means that we have the Tontadas, which are missing 100 years of their history books, and then the people of Wano, who wrote history from that 100-year period on the Poneglyphs. So why is there this discrepancy? And how is Wano the only place that seemed to be able to write things down during this gap in time? Well, I think that all ties back to the idea of a cleansing, and the fact that Wano is surrounded by a very tall border that was meant to keep things out. I mean, while its main job has been to keep out the Big Mom pirates, it's tall enough to keep out other unwanted enemies and even potential rising tides as well. We also have Marijua, which is high up on top of the Red Line. So isn't it a little weird that both locations have a type of border that at least requires climbing something high up to get there? I mean, Zunisha is the same way. So what is up with all these important places being so high up? Well, when you hear the idea of a cleansing, you probably think of washing something, maybe like using water somewhere in the process. And if the world government truly wanted to wipe out certain people from history, a flood would be a great way to do that. And I know that a flood isn't a brand new idea, but trust me, there's going to be a lot of new information here too. And one of the best pieces of evidence for this flood is that Marijua is the only place allowed to be way up on top of the Red Line, where it probably could avoid any type of flood. And a global flood shouldn't sound that crazy given that we've already seen the Noah, which ties to the story of Noah's Ark and the Great Flood. And the Noah is in Fishman Island, which is directly beneath the Red Line in Marijua. Plus, One Piece is a story that's all about pirates and sailing adventures, so a flood just ties in perfectly. And think about how big the Red Line is, and the fact it stretches to the bottom of the sea almost everywhere except where Fishman Island is. That displaces a lot of water. And since we have reason to believe that the Red Line isn't exactly natural because of the whales, levels, that raises some suspicions about the water level right off the bat. And I want to give a big shout out to my boy Den Cushy, who had a very different flood video, but still gave me a lot of ideas for this one. But something that some of you may already be wondering is how the Tontatas just picked back up on their history after the 800-year mark if they were wiped out by a flood. Because there shouldn't even be any history left from before the 900-year mark if they were wiped out, let alone history from exactly after the 800-year mark. I mean, shouldn't they all just be dead from old age at the very least? And if they didn't reproduce, how is there still history in a Tontata civilization at all? And why is the gap exactly 100 years anyhow? Surely they'd remember losing loved ones or having their town flooded during that time. Well, I think part of it is because the flood and the exact 100-year gap are somewhat separate events, but were both caused by the same thing that I'll cover in just a few minutes. But the way that the Tontatas may have avoided the flood was because that they lived in a kingdom ruled by the Don Quixote family, who is actually the only royal family that we know the name of who decided to move to Marijois after the Void Century. The Nefertari family famously decided to not move there, and we don't know the names of any of the other 18 kingdoms that were affiliated with the world government and moved 800 years ago. So that's why I think this bit of history is extremely important, because it's really the only family that we know of who was in charge of their kingdom 900 years ago and then moved to Marijois. Even before the Void Century happened, the Don Quixote family enslaved the Tontata, and all the humans that lived there were wealthy because of it. The Tontatas agreed to provide labor for food and shelter, but as we've seen plenty of times in our world even, that basically just amounts to slavery. And ironically enough, once the Don Quixote family came back in the form of Doflamingo, they were once again forced to work on the farms. But this time, it was to help with the smile fruits. So this makes me wonder if the Don Quixotes of the past and the Tontatas actually had something to do with the original devil fruits, since they were working on the farm right before the Void Century and all. And we know that Oda loves his parallels. But after the 900-year mark, there's this 100-year gap where the Riku family then suddenly appears as the new leaders, and the Don Quixote family is in Marijois. So is it possible that the Don Quixotes just bought their way into the new world government and into Marijois with the money that they raised up using the Tontatas as slaves? And then they were also able to have their kingdom be spared from the Great Cleansing, probably. I mean, it would make sense that the kingdoms belonging to those who became celestial dragons wouldn't be destroyed, right? And as for how they avoided the flood, I'm honestly not so sure, but I think there's a lot of ways that you could explain it. Maybe it's just another layer to Imu's power, or maybe it's some other devil fruit or technology altogether. But I think a flood could also explain why Wano had their extremely tall borders. While the inside of Wano is currently flooded out with rainwater, we know that that wasn't always the case, and that's because Sukiyaki showed us that Wano was once empty and then slowly filled up over time. So maybe at first, the borders were actually meant to keep water out, and then in ironic Oda fashion, their kingdom got flooded anyway, but by rainwater, while trying to avoid flooding from seawater. I mean, this would explain why they were still able to record the history during this time on the Poneglyphs without being affiliated with the world government or anything. This creates an interesting dilemma for Momo as well, where destroying the borders lets Pluton out and opens their country to global flooding risk. Although their main settlement is way above sea level now, so the latter shouldn't be as much of an issue. But if you think about it, Robin did mention that the reason that Old Wano was preserved so well was because of the rainwater. So if it gets covered with seawater, I think that this line might imply that it would then deteriorate over time, potentially like a lot of other kingdoms around the world, and that's why we don't see them or know about their history. This makes Wano, Zou, Sky Islands, the Moon, or other planets technically, and the Red Line as some of the only places that could survive a giant flood. And almost all of these places have insanely important history behind them. We were even told that the Red Line was God's land, or the Kingdom of the Gods, well before Marijois was up there, thanks to Marco when he was reminiscing about his time with Whitebeard. And the Lunarians supposedly lived up there before they were wiped out. Maybe that was all because the eventual celestial dragons wanted to seize that territory as their own to survive a giant flood that they had planned, and to usurp power from the current gods of the world, which were the Lunarians with their ability to live in harsh environments, fly, and even utilize fire, basically like dragons. I mean, they're still offering the big bucks for information on currently living Lunarians, and I think the Seraphims are now another example of the power that Lunarians possess, as well as the world government's respect for their strength. And the existence of the Red Line well before Merigeois and the world government tells me that it wasn't originally created for the express purpose of a flood, but the fact that Laboon and the other island whales bang their head on it tells me that it has to be unnatural. So how can both of those things be true? Well, the biggest clue to that is this line from Nami about the Red Line being a chain of connected islands, all with different climates, as opposed to just one continuous unit. So it's kind of like Wano, but all made of stone and in a straight line. This immediately makes me think of Oars being called the continent puller, and while people have theorized that he put Wano together, maybe he also has a tie to the Red Line. Maybe the Lunarians and Oars, who could have just been Joyboy, wanted to create a certain part of the Red Line for a good purpose, but the world government took it from them and even decided to block off all of the seas, which is why the whales now bang their head on it and why we have the four blues, the calm belts, the reverse mountain, etc. And ironically, if the Red Line were to be destroyed or removed at any point, then the sea level would drop dramatically, which also adds to the idea that it's artificial, and that would also reduce the risk of global flooding and potentially even reveal a lot more land than we've seen thus far, meaning that removing the Red Line could show us a world with lower sea levels where every single island is connected, like a much bigger version of Long Ring Longland, which might even have Laugh Tale under it, just like I said in my Laugh-Ro Tale video, like a version of the Pangea that existed on our Earth a long time ago, which is double weird given that Merigeois' main castle name is Pangea Castle, and we even saw ruins at the bottom of the sea during Jinbei's cover story, which adds even more fuel to the fire that the water level is kind of artificially increased thanks to the unnatural Red Line. And Emu is currently the king of the world, you could say, much like the goals of Rocks and Blackbeard, which makes me think that there could be some strong parallels here. Like, what if Emu assembled the strongest team that he could, like Rocks definitely did and Blackbeard also did in level 6 of Impel Down, and also used some underhanded tactics like Blackbeard always does to take over the Red Line at the last second to use for his own advantage and take over the world. This could even tie into the first Davy back fight, which connects directly to acquiring strong crews and using underhanded tactics just like Foxy did. And the first one coincidentally occurred on Hachinosu Island, which ties to Rocks and Blackbeard directly. But generally speaking, I feel pretty confident that Emu and Joyboy just had different agendas with the Red Line, and somehow a Davy backfight was used to stop Joyboy from achieving his goal, because Joyboy definitely wanted to keep the seas free and clear, while Emu likely wanted to use the Red Line to constrict the world, to aid him in his eventual goal of a great cleansing. But how would Emu have even caused this great flood in the first place, as well as this blank 100-year gap in history? Well, I think that ties back into one of the most consistent themes in the One Piece story. Swirls. Yes, swirls. Like Sanji's eyebrows, the devil fruits, and even a million other places throughout the One Piece story. But most notably, we can see swirls even in the planet itself. Yes, I mean the entire planet Earth, and all of the planets in fact. Oda even mentioned in an SBS that swirls are so important because if the planets all stopped spinning, the world would be covered in tidal waves. It would be terrible, and Sanji's eyebrows channel that very same circular energy. This highlights that the planet swirling is extremely important, almost as important as making the world one piece again by removing the Red Line and freeing up the oceans. It's almost like the world has two conditions to be right again, or to be in homeostasis, which are be one piece, which is not split up by the Red Line, and then swirling so there's no flooding or tidal waves. And with Merigeois on top of the Red Line, we can see Emu and the world government are already involved in making the world not one piece, so I think the cleansing could be tied to the other important factor, the swirling of the planet. If they stop the planet from spinning, massive waves would just crash into the Red Line from both sides, but also flood out most other kingdoms that are at sea level, thus truly be providing the world government with a great cleansing. Only places like Skypiea, maybe Zo, and maybe Wano would have a chance to survive by being so high up. And coincidentally, all those places are just packed with history. This also puts Joyboy's apology to Poseidon into a different perspective, because Fishman Island is directly underneath the Red Line, which would have needed to be destroyed in order to stop Imu's plot to stop the world and cause a flood. It also reminds me of Madame Chiarli's prophecy for Luffy in the future. That prophecy is probably what Joyboy had to do as well, but failed to. In the process of destroying at least the ocean-covering parts of the Red Line to free up the world, those that are in Fishman Island would have needed to load onto the Noah and leave the island to go to the surface just out of necessity because of the falling debris. And since the celestial dragons would likely be taken out in this instance since they live on the Red Line, the fishmen would also have a better chance to live on the surface in peace since there's no longer celestial dragons to control the world. But the ultimate question is, how in the hell could Imu manage to stop the planet from spinning? And even if there were floods, what the hell is up with the exact 100-year gap in history that the Tentata seem to have faced? Well, Imu could have slowed the planet down the same way that anyone would slow anything down in One Piece, like with a slow particle. The same undiscovered light particle that Foxy's fruit utilizes to freeze things in place for exactly 30 seconds. I know he's Foxy, but in my other videos I've already highlighted how important this man can be. But most notably the fact that he and Imu both likely have light powers. Imu launched an attack on Leloucia which looked like 16 rays of light specifically, and if you haven't heard that before, then I did a whole video on that called Sun God Imu that might fill in a lot of blanks here. And while I don't want to recap that entire thing, I do think it's important to at least repeat a few things, like the fact that Kizaru's beams are drawn in a very similar way to Imu's beams in that panel, and we haven't even seen a superior or inferior version of Kizaru's fruit yet. Aokiji and Akainu were shown by Oda to have superior versions of different fruits, but we got nothing about Kizaru. And Kizaru is still in his original admiral position, while the other two went on to pursue what are likely bigger goals. Perhaps that is all because Kizaru has an inferior version of another fruit, like Imu's potential light fruit, that would let him manipulate all kinds of light and not just the one type that Kizaru uses. Or maybe he comes from some type of race that can manipulate all types of light naturally, kind of like how fishmen can manipulate water. So I really wouldn't rule out this possibility either. This would include sunlight that I talked all about in my Imu video, which would give him sun god-like powers, which we know sun gods are very important in the world of One Piece. But it can also include unknown types of light to the current civilization, like the slow particle. Foxy specifically told us that his fruit lets him use a currently undiscovered light particle, which slows things down for exactly 30 seconds. If Imu can use this type of light, what if he can cast it over the entire planet, leaving only the water unaffected, either by choice or simply because the fruit's power just doesn't work on water? This would cause massive tidal waves and flooding that I've talked about earlier in the video, and likely wipe out a lot of people, except those who were high up to avoid them. But the people on the planet would probably just be frozen in time as well, at least those without devil fruits, haki, or mirrors or something to avoid it. And instead of 30 seconds like Foxy, Imu would probably be strong enough to freeze them in place for 100 years. And while Foxy just froze people's body in place, I think Imu could freeze everything, including their aging, breathing, and even their mind. It would all just be over in the blink of an eye for everyone on the planet from their perspective, but in reality, 100 years would pass. This would explain how there's exactly a 100-year gap in history all over the world, except for Wano, which not only had borders to avoid the floods, but they were also the only place to make sea stone. So maybe they used that substance, or they just simply went underground where Pluton is conveniently located to avoid getting frozen in time. And this would also allow them to make the Poneglyphs, which seem to be made in almost some type of volcano type environment the one time that we saw them. And this all aids the idea of hiding underground even more. And how would the Wano people even safely transport those massive stones after the 800-year mark hit anyways? Every samurai that we've seen sucks at sailing, so I think they probably used some type of underground tunnels instead that were built by Pluton. If you know this channel well, then you know that I think Pluton is definitely a mole, but I'm actually working on a big video that explains this underground railroad type system and even more reasons why Pluton is absolutely positively 100% a mole. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss when that video drops. But then this all brings me back to Toki, who fits in perfectly with this theory. When I was considering the perfect 100-year gap, her power was one that caught my attention thanks to 3Day on Discord, who said that everyone on Earth may have just been thrown forward in time with Toki's fruit or a similar power, so that's why it's a void or blank century, because literally nobody was there. I tried finding another way to kind of tie all these pieces together and kind of mimic that effect of there just being nobody on Earth for 100 years, and that's when it all hit me. If there was a flood and a stoppage of time for the people around the world, then Toki was likely sent forward to simply avoid these events, and the only way that she'd have wanted to seek out Wano since she was a little girl was if her parents told her about it, or someone else that she grew up with, which makes a lot of sense since her family name is Amatsuki, which was one of the original daimyo families in Wano. So I bet they told her how great the country was, and maybe even that it's still a safe place relative to the rest of the world that she was born into, and that's why she holds it in such high regard. Toki was supposedly born 830 years ago, which puts her birth at 70 years into the Void Century, and as far as I know, that's the only birth that we know of in that 100-year gap. But how can someone be born if everybody is frozen in time or wiped out from a flood? Well, we have to keep in mind that somebody had to have her fruit before she was born, so it was probably one of her parents, who were from the Amatsuki clan but apparently made their way out of Wano at some point. So maybe her parents skipped forward just a little bit in time 900 years ago just to avoid the slow beam and the flood, and then they kept trying to make their way back into Wano. This would partially explain why Toki wanted to go there so badly, and they may have even known that it was their one safe haven thanks to the borders that were put up. And this also got me thinking that Toki is essentially a 780-year version of the Scabbards. She was sent forward to avoid a great danger, which in this case might be getting frozen in time and seeing all those great tidal waves, all to get back to Wano and at least partially help bring the dawn in the future. And obviously she gave birth to Momonosuke, who is incredibly important, so her lineage may also be a reason why her parents needed her to go there and be safe. When Toki had the chance to go forward again and save herself, she refused, almost as if her mission was complete in a sense, probably because she did make it to Wano, and she had Momonosuke, who is obviously paramount to whatever Oden talked about in his journal. But as for the 100-year gap, while the rest of the world would be frozen in time, I think the World Government Alliance obviously would have had some way of avoiding it, like using mirrors or even hiding in the actual mirror world. And if you think about it, those who did get hit with the beam probably wouldn't even drown since they aren't really breathing either. Which makes me think that the floods and tsunamis were primarily for devil fruit users. This element to the Void Century could be a quick way to collect all the devil fruits and reset or cleanse the world in a number of ways. And the very few powerful stragglers that survive both the tsunami and the slow beam would probably just be easy pickings versus the world government at that point. So the World Government Alliance probably spent some time defeating whatever remaining enemies were still left, and then waiting for the tides to eventually settle so that they could start doing anything that they wanted to all the countries and people that they didn't like. They could commit mass genocide in some places, and then just leave people alone in the countries that allied with them, like the Tentadas in Dressrosa. Since the Don Quixote family joined the world government and even moved to Marijois, everyone in Dressrosa was likely spared due to that association, and that's why there's not even a mention of some people going missing or dying during the 100 years. Maybe the entire cleansing idea was basically that everyone would get wiped out except those from the 20 countries, and the royalty of those 20 could opt to come to Marijois and be in royalty forever. So then the population of almost the entire planet are literally just descendants of those 20 great nations. It almost reminds me of Doflamingo and his bird cage, when he wanted to kill everyone and restart the country so that nobody knew knew that he was the bad guy. The world government probably froze everyone that they could for 100 years, wiped out the rest, and then only left those who didn't know the truth. I mean, the people in Dressrosa from before the Void Century had a lot of money thanks to the Tintada's slavery, so they were probably not that motivated to become pirates or anything because they liked the world that they had. So if the world government went around killing everyone except them and residents of other allied wealthy nations that had a similar mindset, the world government wouldn't have had that many people looking for vengeance on them, like all of the pirates do today. That's what made Roger starting the Great Pirate Era such a threat to them. So maybe after 800 years of oppression, the general sentiment around the globe starts to change, just as we have seen in the story already, which makes me think that their goal is probably to cleanse the earth of as many threats as they can every 800 years or so, and then institute a new world that has no idea that they're the enemy. The World Government Alliance probably resulted in a massive army thanks to the fact that they had 20 wealthy nations allied together. So they could have easily gone around during the Void Century just slaughtering or kidnapping as many people as they could, since they were all helpless and frozen in time. This is why all recorded history ends 900 years ago, and then some pick back up at exactly 800 years ago with no recollection of the events. They were either spared so they don't even know what happened, or they were just killed off and there's no history to write. Except in Wano, of course, where they may have avoided the beam due to sea stone or being underground or what have you. The world government could have even taken people back to Marijois to be their slaves once the slow beam effect wore off. Or they used their remaining lifespan to boost that of the Gorosei and Emu. This could be a reason why it happens every 800 years. Maybe that's just the right amount of time for the Earth to get populated again, where they then do another great cleansing and re-up on their lifespans, and then let the Earth go on with only people from selected nations remaining and repeat. As for that 800 year factor, I think having the planets line up or be involved in some type of way could also explain the specificity of the timeline, because I mean, it would make sense since they're celestial dragons and all, but I'm trying to find something different than that for the 800 year factor just because it feels kind of obvious. And I think taking lifespans and kind of resetting the mindset of the populace to be less vengeful makes a lot of sense. I go back and forth on it though, because I also can't rule out that every 800 years the moon is just in the perfect position to bounce a slow beam off of or something either. Or maybe like Oda said, if the moon and the sun stop spinning, that would also be very bad. So maybe Emu just freezes all of the planets at once they're lined up. Let me know if you have any other ideas for that 800 year time frame down below in the comments. And all of this talk about light is really interesting given what Vegapunk has been doing on Egghead in the recent chapters. We have seen light form into holograms that can appear as almost anything that your imagination can think of. They can even take a physical form which can be hit by the phonetic gloves. And right after we learned about all of this, we see CP0 discussing that they are meant to kill Vegapunk. Could these factors all be tied together potentially? Is Vegapunk flying too close to the sun, no pun intended? Is he getting too close to figuring out how Emu's powers work and potential counters to them? I mean, it would be pretty hard to hit light without those gloves after all. And if Emu can control all kinds of light, then Emu can probably make some insane holograms that are made of lights with properties that we've never even seen before. It's almost like Emu's imagination would be the limit on what they can create, which fits perfectly into how Luffy's imagination is what drives him into Gear 5th. Emu might be able to make lights with any type of properties, because if we have a slow beam, maybe there's also a speed beam that we haven't discovered, or an age beam, or really any beam that he could think of that might mimic all of the devil fruit powers. And if Emu was truly connected to Joyboy in the past, this could have made those two like two sides of the same coin, both with endless imaginations, but different abilities that permitted it and different ways of using it in the world. And since Emu has a giant straw hat in Marijois, maybe they really were connected closely in the past. So that got me thinking about something else. If Emu's lights can have undiscovered properties like Foxy's did, what if these lights are just tied to how devil fruits work in the first place? What if devil fruits are really all just real holograms essentially? As if someone used their light powers to create fruits that enable people to have insane powers that go to the furthest stretches of our imagination. I do have a lot more to say about this that will come in a future video that's all about the creation of devil fruits and how their wills work. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss that one. And lastly, let's think about Blackbeard. Blackbeard controls darkness, and he can create a black hole which light can't escape from. It's the perfect counter to someone who uses light, because regardless of what kind of light Emu uses, it shouldn't work as well in the presence of a black hole. And given Blackbeard's ties to Rox, who knew a lot about the world's history, and even the fact that Blackbeard and Rox had the same home base where the first Davy Back fight ever occurred, I think Blackbeard could potentially know all about Emu's powers, or at least the counter required to beat him, so that he can also try to become the king of the world. Well, please drop a like if you enjoyed anything that I had to say, because that's all I had for today's video, but make sure to check out one of these two videos. Until next time, later.